Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, and it's a pleasure to moderate this panel and, as everyone else has said, to be in these wonderful surroundings. The first decade of this new century saw Europe style itself as the leader, the world leader in climate policy. And this seemed entirely appropriate. The first decade was a moment of increasing optimism and confidence in the European construction. The Union was expanding and things seemed to be going well. Climate change was also a global problem and one that would certainly dominate the new century. And if a new entity, a new political entity in creation was to choose a problem to emphasize and to take a unique role, it would certainly be this one to go ahead. Furthermore, it was an occasion to demonstrate what at that time was often discussed of soft power as an exhibition of soft power to distinguish it from that advocate of hard power that was making such a, say, not entirely successful demonstration of that concept at the contemporaneous time, and which had furthermore turned its back on the Kyoto Protocol. And all of this was summarized as a phrase that at least sticks in my mind, and many of you may remember, which was a green environmental minister of one of the member states who characterized Europe as the environmental conscience of the world. So I think that symbolizes sort of the thinking that existed at that time. Now, the surprise was, having designated itself or taken on this role, the surprise was to many who, you remember the critique at that time, was that Europe was very long on words but very short on actions. And that, lo and behold, the surprise was that if we look at climate policy, there's really nowhere else in the world where we can see climate policy in action, imperfect as it will invariably be, but still at a level of ambition, a level of elaboration that cannot be found, and moving beyond aspiration at a level that cannot be found, or can be found in only very few other areas of the world. The second decade of the century that we're now starting off has started off with changes that seem to undercut the assumptions that made this leadership position possible. There's been the Great Recession, which has certainly absorbed attention on both sides of the Atlantic. And in Europe, the sovereign debt crisis, which has manifested itself most clearly in Europe and oftentimes referred to as the Euro crisis, about which we heard much yesterday. The momentum on the international front, which had been building during the first decade and seemed to be reaching a climax of achievement towards the end of that decade, with Copenhagen being called at the end of the decade and a president elected in the United States who promised to deliver on climate change. And of course, both of these turned out in many ways to be disappointments, at least with respect to the expectations that existed at that time. And then, as if these changes in the sort of economic context and the international environment were not enough, there were literally tectonic changes in geopolitics which were occurring, which were changing, and of which we heard many references yesterday, which are changing Europe's place in the world and calling for new thinking about how it would organize itself and how it would position itself with the US turning away from the Atlantic and increasingly towards the rising power to the west of the United States, and increasingly Europe having to define itself with its neighborhood in new terms. So that's where we are today. And we have two excellent speakers to lead us into the discussion of the state of the Union, the state of the European Union with respect to climate policy. The first speaker will be Carlo Carrero, the rector of the University of Ca' Foscata, Venice. Carlo has made important contributions for well over 20 years to climate policy and as an academic on climate policy and climate economics. And he is a vice chairman of the IP, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which importantly summarizes much of the academic literature and then for the benefit of policymakers. The second speaker, who I'll say a few words about now before calling him to the floor to follow Carlo, is Jos Delbecq, the Director General of DG Climate Action at the European Commission. Now, all of you are aware of the phrase that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. Now, I, as many of you will know, regard the EU ETS as a success, an unquestioned success. And if there's anyone who can lay claim to being, although there are many fathers, if there's anyone who can lay claim to having been one of those, if not a foremost father, is Jos Delbecq. So we're pleased to have him with us. Following the speakers' presentations, as was done in this morning's panel, we have 5 commenters to make individual points and to comment on the presentations of the speakers, and then we will open the floor. So Carlo, if you'd lead off, please. Thank you.